All right, so let's take a look at where we are in this process. Last Sunday night, if memory serves me correctly, we spent most of our time talking. Oops, knew that was going to happen. Talking about the years of silence. Does my memory serve me correctly on that? And that's where we left off. I realize that world history is not everybody's cup of tea. Quite frankly, it wasn't mine when I was in school. I wish I'd have paid closer attention. Um, but and so as a consequence, that this section in particular can get a little bit tedious. But it is helpful to understand um, where the world was during this time frame and how we got to the point in history where we are when we get to the pages of the New Testament. I think that is helpful. Ironically, uh, my brother-in-law um, is has been clearing out his library, and he gave me a bunch of his books. And as I was going through them and cataloging them and installing them in my library, um, there was a book that was added to the history section of my library entitled "Between the Testaments," and it was intriguing. I was familiar with the author's name, but not familiar with this particular book. So I eventually hope to get to it among the 1,000 other books in my library that I eventually hope to read. Um, but it is but it is helpful to have at least a cursory and working knowledge of this period. So let's shift gears and talk about the New Testament. Um, there are uh, well, very quickly, um, who tell me the three Bible time periods that compose the New Testament. The first one is
Life of Christ.
the life of Christ. What's the second one?
Early church.
All right, the early church. Remember, it's the people, not the building, but the people. The early church, and then finally
Letters to Christians.
letters to Christians. All right. Um, let's just refresh ourselves. When we talk about the life of Christ, what books of the New Testament are we referring to?
Four Gospels.
All right, the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When we talk about the early church, what are we talking about?
Acts.
The book of Acts. And then letters to Christians.
Romans to Revelation.
Romans to Revelation. We typically don't talk about Revelation as being an epistle. It is more technically classified as a book of prophecy, and that's true. But it was written, even though it is prophetic in nature, it is written to Christians. And so in that sense, we put it in the same category. It may not strictly be a letter in the sense of the others, but the idea is that it was written to Christians of the first century. So let's talk about the let's talk about a simple outline of the life of Christ. It can get a lot more detailed, but let's just talk about a simple outline of events for the life of Christ. It begins with, and this is how Brother Waldron has outlined it, and I think it fairly well simplifies things. You have first years of preparation. About how old was Jesus when he began his public work?
30.
About
About
30.
30. And so you've got 30 years of his life about which we don't really know a whole lot. We have some vignettes, we have some bits and pieces that are that are instructive, that are telling, and we have references later in his life back to his childhood and rearing and background that inform us. But there's a lot of details about that first 30 years that we don't know. Um, and the years of preparation take us essentially from his birth all the way up through the time that Jesus begins his public work. So, if the first part is years of preparation, what do you think the second part of this outline is?
His work, his
Yeah.
ministry.
The beginning of his ministry. Okay, I'm not leaving you. I'm grabbing something off my shelf, so don't panic. My apologies. I meant to have a reference in front of me, some extra notes of my own. So in the years of preparation are the first 30 years. And the one thing that I neglected to mention in connection with the years of preparation, that also includes the work of John the Baptist. Remember, John came as a herald, as a forerunner, paving the way for Jesus. And so that's an important part of that. And so then you have, when he was about 30 years old, the beginning of Jesus' work. And so this includes things that come at the very beginning, maybe the first, as much as maybe the first 6 months or so of his public work. This includes things that kind of set the work in motion, like the baptism of Jesus, his temptations, the call of the first disciples, and Jesus' time in Judea and then leaving Judea. Most of what we know Jesus' life for, most of the big events that we know from the life of Jesus happened where? You've got Jerusalem, obviously, in connection with his trial and death and resurrection. But let's set Jerusalem aside for a moment. Geographically, where are most of those things centered?
Galilee?
Galilee. And that's why it's called the Great Galilean Ministry. So something like a year and a half or 2 years is encompassed in the Great Galilean Ministry. And this includes so much of his teaching, so many of his miracles. The Sermon on the Mount is included during this time. I mean, it is just an incredible period of time. So much of the things for which Jesus is famous, I'm going to use that word. It's not my favorite word in this context, but you understand, for which he is most well known and most recognized, even by those who know very little about the Bible, fit into this period of the great Galilean ministry. So after the great Galilean ministry, you have what are called periods of retirement. And the word retirement doesn't mean, in this context, Jesus quit working, or that he wasn't as active as he had been previously. What this means is that Jesus was withdrawing from the crowds, or at least attempting to withdrawing from the more withdrawing from Galilee, withdrawing from Judea, trying to get away and spending more time or attempting to spend more time just with his apostles. And so this begins about a year before his death, and it's about a 6-month period where you have at least 4 times that Jesus retires or withdraws. That's the periods of retirement. And then about 6 months before his death, we begin the close of his public work. And so this begins in John chapter 7, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths or Feast of Tabernacles. And then you have him there later at the Feast of Dedication, or what today we would refer to as Hanukkah. Not a feast that is prescribed in the Old Testament, but one that developed during the years of silence. And then his final journey to Jerusalem leading up to his arrest. Then you have the events of the last week. The last week of Jesus' life. So quite literally Friday to Friday. But this includes, in particular, the triumphal entry and the seemingly daily conflicts that he had with the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem during the final week that led up to his crucifixion. He would go into Jerusalem in the day. He would withdraw back out to the village of Bethany at night. And this includes things like the final Passover that Jesus observed with his apostles, and in that context, instituting the Lord's Supper. This includes his trial, and then ultimately his death and burial. And then you have everything from the first day of the week, the day of Jesus' resurrection, until the time of his ascension that's recorded in Acts chapter 1, the resurrection days. So from the time of his resurrection, his appearances to the apostles and to others, and then leading up to the time that Jesus ascended back to the Father. How many days was that? Test your Bible knowledge, your memory.
So 40?
40 days, according to Acts chapter 1. According to Acts chapter 1. So if the resurrection days were 40 days, how many days between the time of Jesus' ascension and the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2? About 10. Pentecost was essentially 50 days after Passover. And so numbering from Jesus' death, at Passover to the day of Pentecost is 50 days. 40 of those days, Jesus was after his resurrection. So about 10, maybe plus or minus 1, just depending on how you count. So that's a brief outline of the life of Jesus, not in any way exhaustive. And within each of those periods, there is some debate about chronology. I'll get it out in a second. As to exactly, what came first. Did this event happen before this one? Because you've got 4 records, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And harmonizing those, understanding them together, a lot of that can be done. But there are some where you're just not sure which came first. And it doesn't really matter. But at least broadly, generally, we can follow the events of Jesus' life by that outline. All right. Any questions about that? Y'all are a talkative bunch tonight. All right. You wouldn't believe, I know this sounds silly to you all, but you all wouldn't believe how much difference it makes on my voice having taught Bible class this morning. So I'm sorry that I'm having to drink on camera, but well, Laura's doing it. I saw Alan do it a while ago, so you all will just have to. All right. I guess if Paul managed his thorn in the flesh, I can handle a weak voice. All right, let's talk about our next Bible time period, the early church, talking about the book of Acts. Eventually, if you all are willing to take on a challenge with me, we can actually talk about the contents of every chapter of the book of Acts. I know, I remember when I was a teenager, I was not part of this class, but I learned about a teacher who was someone I knew who taught his teen Bible class, and they memorized, I don't mean word for word as to recite the book of Acts, but they memorized what was in every chapter of the book of Acts. So in other words, Acts chapter 1 was resurrection and Matthias. Acts chapter 2 was the day of Pentecost, etc. And I've never undertaken that myself. I've told myself, for the last 25 years that I was going to do that. And I've never done it. But that's, I think, an incredibly practical exercise, because it is an outline of early church history, but it also is a great evangelistic tool, so that when you go to talk about, accounts of conversion, you can recall, oh, where do I go in the book of Acts to talk about this particular account? So we're not going to undertake that challenge anytime real soon, but if you're up for it, maybe we can consider doing that. Even if we don't do it as a whole group, those of you who want to join me in that can. I'm thinking like, Ella, Allie in particular. Okay. All right. Let's talk about a brief outline of the early church from the book of Acts. The book of Acts covers a span of about 30 years. And so if you, it's from about the year AD 30 to about the year AD 60. Now, let me clarify something. You've got, we said Jesus' earthly work began when he was about 30 years old. And then we've got some 3.5 years of his work. So if the AD starts with the birth of Jesus, why is it only AD 30? The reason is that because many moons ago, the historian who established the date of Jesus' birth, and therefore the mark that divides BC and AD, got it wrong. That's not a Bible problem. That was a history problem. And so while you would think that Jesus' birth would be in the first year AD, it would be at that breaking point. The truth of the matter is, because the historians who divided BC and AD got it wrong, Jesus was actually born in 4 BC. As we understand dating, Jesus was actually born before Christ. I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's true. So rather than centuries later attempt to readjust the whole calendar, we just corrected some dating. So So Jesus' death and therefore the establishment of the church, the events of Acts chapter 2, all are in AD 30. Does that make sense? Did everybody follow that explanation? So when you see AD 30, don't let that throw you off. Okay, so excuse me. So about 30 years of history. Acts chapters 1 through 12 are primarily the work in Jerusalem, Palestine, and the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. So if you, let me see if I have a, all right, I'm going to put a map up here on the screen. And so when we talk about Jerusalem, there's Jerusalem. This region is Palestine. This is the Mediterranean Sea. So we're talking about the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. All right. So geographically, that's what we're talking about. It's fairly, it's a fairly limited area. And that's about the first 15 years of early church history. That's Acts chapter 1. So we're primarily Jerusalem, Palestine, and the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. And again, covers about 15 years of Bible history. Some have suggested that Acts chapters 1 through 12 focuses on the work of the Apostle Peter. And certainly he is one of, if not the major character in the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts. The second half of the book, and not literally half, but the second section of the book, chapters 13 through 28, is primarily the work of the Apostle Paul. And with it, the spread of the gospel into all the Roman Empire. So if you'll excuse me for flipping back and forth here, everything in the pink is the Roman Empire in the first century. So while in chapters 1 through 12, you have the work relatively localized in this area, now in the rest of the book of Acts and chronicled through the journeys and the work of the Apostle Paul, certainly not the only character, but he's the one whose story is most closely followed. You have the spread of the gospel up through Cappadocia, the provinces of Asia, across the Aegean Sea, onto the continent of Europe. That includes Achaia. This is the region where you would find Corinth. Corinth would be right here on the isthmus. Here's Athens, Greece. Up here is Philippi. Thessalonica is up here as well. Ultimately, with Paul going all the way to Rome, and he talks about the spread of the gospel even as far as Spain. Now, we don't have a history of it going that far, but there is reference to that. So just to give you some idea of the geography that is involved in this process. So Acts chapters 1 through 12, and suddenly, there we go. Acts chapters 1 through 12, primarily the main character at least appears to be the Apostle Peter. You have a relatively limited geography covering about 15 years, but then you have the work of Paul, the spread of the gospel into the rest of the Roman Empire, and again, another 15-year period. Now, another way to outline the book of Acts is found in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. And I think it actually is intended by the construction of Luke and the way that he writes the book of Acts as a historian to sort of be a theme statement or an outline of the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, just prior to Jesus' ascension back to heaven, Jesus said to the apostles, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and in Samaria and even to the remotest part of the earth." Well, that's kind of what we're talking about. The work beginning in Jerusalem, Judea, the area around Jerusalem, that's Palestine, Samaria, which is also part of Palestine, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. And so in some way, Acts chapter 1, verse 8 serves as an outline for the book of Acts itself. Any questions about that? Okay, let's talk about letters to Christians. Romans through Revelation. As we've said before, this includes all of the epistles and Revelation because they were all written to Christians. Some were written to individuals. You have, for example, Paul's letter to Philemon and his letters to Timothy and to Titus. So some of the letters are written to individuals. Some of them are written to churches, the church at Corinth, the church at Thessalonica, the churches of Galatia. But all of them to Christians. And so that thus the name of this Bible time period. So both individuals and churches. Some letters to a single church, some to multiple. There are 6 of these that were written during the time described in the book of Acts. So there are 6 letters, and we will do our best to pinpoint where they fit later. But there are 6 of these that were written during the time described in the book of Acts. Now that means there's a whole bunch that fall outside or after the book of Acts, but there are 6 of them that fit into the book of Acts. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Romans. So 6 of the letters to Christians fit into the chronology or the history of the book of Acts. And that's it. We're done.
Did you list them in that order for a reason?
That's a good question. I can't remember. Hang on just a second. Look. Let me see.
I just thought maybe that was the order in which they were.
And that
written,
may
maybe.
that may very well be right.
I'm sure you had a reason.
I'm sure I did, but right now it's escaping me, and you're giving me far more credit than I probably deserve on that.
I think she understands you.
Yeah, I know. A little scary, actually. Diana, my gut tells me that yes, that's the chronological order, but for the life of me right now, I can't say that for absolute certainty. And so, and it's what I was turning back and looking at my notes that I have here, and right now I can't put my finger on that. And so I'm going to say, let me get back to you about that.
That's
No,
fine.
no. Yes.
That's 2 things you have to research now.
What was the first one? I've already forgotten.
Proprietor.
Oh. Yeah. See, I told you. All right, I'm getting out a Post-it note from my desk drawer, and I'm researching proprietor for Tom. Don't ask, that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
And then I'm gonna say epistle order ? Okay. And maybe I'll remember what that means. Okay. So we've got about 3 minutes left. And so let's do something that we haven't done in a while. All right. We're going to do what comes first. And so we're going to since we don't have a lot of time, we're just going to stick to the 17 Bible time periods. All right. So I'm going to call on you, and I am going to trust that you are not looking at notes when I ask you. All right. So I'm going to give you 2 Bible time periods, and you tell me which came first. Of the 2 Bible time periods I give you, you tell me which came first. All right. All right. I just looked at my screen and I saw Allie first. So Allie, you're up first. All right. It just luck of the draw. Okay. I might've been looking at you looking for a kid to pick on, but anyway. All right, Allie, which came first? The divided kingdom or Judah alone?
Divided kingdom.
Good. All right. Ella, which came first? The patriarchs or the judges?
Patriarchs.
The patriarchs. All right. Tom, which came first? The captivity or wandering in the wilderness?
Wandering.
Good. Laura, which came first? The years of silence or the scattering of the people?
Scattering of the people.
All right. Jim, which came first? The United Kingdom or the invasion and conquest of the land?
The United Kingdom. Or no, the invasion and conquest.
Okay, all right, good. All right. Vicky, which came first? The return from captivity or the Exodus?
Exodus.
All right, good. Sorry, I'm
Rhonda's behind me or in front of me.
and he throws his wife under the bus. Rhonda, which came first? Letters to Christians or the early church?
Early church.
All right. Stanley, which comes first? The judges or the Exodus?
The Exodus.
The Exodus. Good. All right. And so I realize that's fairly easy, but the point is it ought to be easy. I mean, that ought to just be virtually automatic to have that basic out.